All right, so in our next part, we want to take a look at the inventory slot. Let's head over to the inventory slot script and pop this out. Now in this script, we're going to do something very similar to over here where we create our own class and extend a node. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a class called inventory slot, but we're going to extend panel container. As you can imagine, this is a slot item or a slot per se, and we're going to put an item inside of it. So what do we need to have for this thing? Well, we're going to need a type. Essentially, we're going to need to define, hey, this slot is allowed to take this type of item. Now, the reason we do this is because we have several types of slots. We're going to have two main types, basically, a inventory one, and if you want, a equipment system. Now, that is kind of why I do this, make it a little more dynamic, but we're not going to really go into that into this series. But if you guys would like to check out how I do this, I have a few courses on my website that you can check out. So definitely check those out. And I go in depth on how to do these kind of things, making an equipment system, etc. So let's continue from here. Now, we also need to initialize this node just as we did in the previous one. Now, to initialize this node, what we're going to do, though, is we're going to pass through two things this time instead of just one. We're going to pass through the type, and then we're also going to pass through essentially the size of our slot. So here, if you recall, we only need to initialize or needed to initialize with the item data. But over here, we're going to initialize with the item data type, whatever type I'm putting into this guy, and the size of this slot. So to initialize these, all I need to do is say type over here is equal to t, and then custom minimum size, which is part of the panel container if you didn't know, is equal to CMS, which is just going to be our size, which comes in a vector 2. All right, next we're going to have two different functions that will allow us to do things. The first one is going to be a can drop data, and essentially it'll pass through a at position and a data variant. And this will return Boolean. It's going to essentially tell us, hey, you can drop something here, or well, you can't drop something here. Now, there's a few different cases that we'll take a look at in just a second, but we're going to add one more function called drop data. So this will happen after we, can drop it. If we can drop something, well, we're going to drop it, right? What are we going to do when we drop it? Well, let's take a look at that in just a second, as we're going to add one more last function, and that one is going to be a GUI input. Now, this one, for now, we can just pass on the top. And this one is going to be essentially interacting with the slot. Right? So we're going to have a bunch of things that can allow us to drag and drop things and whatever. But what if I want to use an item? Well, that's what this is for. So firstly, in our can drop data function, we're going to see what do we need? What kind of condition do we need to check? Well, the first condition is going to be, well, what if I'm dropping an item on a slot item or a slot, an inventory slot? Well, that probably means I should return true. Okay, what's another condition that I would return something? Well, if I'm dropping something not on a slot, right, so kind of outside the inventory, well, that would also, well, not also, but that should return false, right? Because that means I'm not dropping it on anything valid. Okay, so there's a few other things that we need to check. So let's say, well, what if I'm trying to drop a equipment thing inside of a non-equipment slot, right? So I'm trying to equip a sword on my head, for example. I need to check the type to see if this is a valid place to drop that item. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to check to see if the data is even in the item inventory. If it is, then that means it's an item, right? That means the data is an item. That means we can actually drop something in this thing. Next, we're going to check to see if the type is equal to main. If it's equal to main, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if the child count is 0. This essentially is checking to see if the slot is empty. Because what we're going to do is we're going to essentially add the slot node, and then add an item as a real node as a child of this slot. Because, or not really because, but on extending of this, this allows us to check to see if there are any children, and if there aren't, that means the slot is empty, and we can simply return true. Now we're going to add an else here. And inside of this else, what we're going to do is we're going to check one more thing, which is to check to see if the data.parent.type is equal to the self.type. So if the data's type is equal to our type, then we can return true as well. Now, outside of this if statement, but inside of the else right here, we're going to return, simply return, get child 0. We're going to get the item, right? Because here, this is checking to see if there is 0, right? If it's not 0, that means it's going to be 1 or 2 or 3. And there is an item, right? If this doesn't happen, that means there's an item. So we're going to get the child. We're going to get the type of that item. And then we're going to return if it is true to ourself, right? Because this is going to essentially, this is an if statement almost, right? This is essentially checking, hey, if the type of the child of the item I have is the same as my own data type, then that means I can swap them. So this is going to return true essentially if it is valid, right? Or it'll return false if it's not true, right? So this is a nice condition that will allow us to do that dynamically. All right, lastly, or not lastly, but there's a little more. Right here on this if statement, we're going to add an else right here. And here we're going to add another condition where we're going to return the data.data type if it's equal to the type. So this time we're going to check to see if the type of our slot is equal to the type of the data. Now, all the way on the bottom, outside of all these if statements, we're just going to return false. This is the last condition or last thing that will happen if all of these fail or if none of these happen. All right, now for the drop data function. Now this one's a little easier. All we need to do is first check to see if the child count is bigger than 0. Now, if it isn't, what we need to do outside of that is just reparent self. So this is quite easy. Now, if the child count is greater than 0, what we'll do is we'll get the item. We'll get the item by simply setting a variable equal to the get child. And then once we do that, I'm going to check to see if the item is equal to the data. This means that I'm trying to put an item in another item that already exists. So imagine I have a slot and I'm holding a sword and the slot has a sword already. I'm going to replace the sword with the same sword. Well, in that case, we don't really need to do anything. We can just return, right? Because we're switching an item with itself. That doesn't need anything to be done. Now, if this doesn't happen, which obviously it probably will many times, all we need to do is reparent the item, the data.getParent. So this will switch the two items that we have essentially. All right, so that's it for the drop data. So it's very simple, nothing too complicated. Now, lastly, in the GUI input. Now, in order to check for GUI input, or to actually make this work, we're going to check to see if event is an input mouse button. I'm going to check to see if I actually click. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add conditions that are going to allow me to left click. Or yeah, I believe it's left click. You can double check this by actually printing the event and see what pops up. You'll find that there's a button index, a button mask, and a lot of other things. So you can give it a try. So you can try right here, essentially print event, and you'll see what pops up. And this is where I get all these. Right. Now, if I left click, what I'm going to do on a slot, if I left click on a slot, I'm not dragging, I'm left clicking. Then I can finally check to see if the child is bigger than 0. That means there's an item inside of it. If there is an item inside of it, well, I also want to check to see if the item that we're clicking on is a misc. This is going to check for a misc item. Now, if it is a misc item, then I want to use that item. Now, there's many ways to use misc items. Now, it's kind of up to you, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially remove that item, -1 the count, and I'm going to use the item in the sense of, okay, let's say I have player health, then I will add to the player health or something. Now, for us, what we'll do is we'll simply subtract to the count. Now, this is cool, but this isn't all we need to do. We need to actually update the timer or the count label. And we can do this by getting the child 0, get the child 0. This is the label, get the text of that label, and then in that label, we're going to set it equal to, well, the get child data count, right? It seems a little complicated and long, but that's about it. So all we're doing is updating the label. Now, if the count is less than 0 or equal to 0, well, I just want to remove that item altogether, right? If the count of that item is 0 now, right? Once I've subtracted 1, if it's 0 or less, I'm just going to queue free. I'm just going to remove and destroy that item. All right, so that is pretty much it for our actual slot. This is a lot of our interaction with the actual items in the slot. So that's cool. Now, in the next part, we'll head over into the main.gd where we actually create a lot of our slots and items dynamically. We'll add a function that allows us to add an item. We'll also add, well, the slots. So let's take a look at how we do that in the next part.